Imagine the morning of March 15th, 2026. Donald Trump signs a single document, and the world that existed for 70 years ceases to exist within minutes. Stay until the end, because what happened next changed everything. NATO always seemed unshakable, like a rock in the middle of the ocean. 32 allies, a nuclear umbrella, collective defense, an architecture of peace built on the ashes of the Second World War by people who had seen with their own eyes what happens when great powers are left alone with their ambitions. 70 years. The Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Balkans, Afghanistan, the alliance survived all of it. It changed, expanded, argued internally, but held together. Because everyone understood, the cost of collapse was too high to even seriously consider. But in 2026, that rock cracked. For months, Washington had been making threats. Trump called the alliance an outdated club of wealthy nations that don't want to pay for their own protection. He demanded Europe raise defense, spending to 3% of GDP. He talked about American soldiers standing on Polish and Estonian bases, defending foreign borders with foreign money, while American cities crumbled from within. Most analysts said, this is rhetoric. This is pressure ahead of another summit. Trump loves drama, but he'll stop before the red line. They were wrong. The executive order was signed in the morning, before most European capitals had even woken up. By noon, its text had circled the entire world. The United States officially initiated withdrawal from the North Atlantic Alliance, citing the article on voluntary membership, incompatibility with national interests, and the need to restore American sovereignty in matters of security. Legally, the withdrawal process was supposed to take a year. But everyone understood, politically, it had already happened the moment Trump put pen to paper. At NATO headquarters in Brussels, silence fell. Not the working silence of meetings, where people are quiet because they're thinking. A different kind. Cold. Like a room where the light has just gone out and no one has found the switch yet. The Secretary General called an emergency session. But what is there to decide when the biggest player has already left the table and closed the door behind him? American representatives were present. Formally, membership was still in effect. But their eyes looked through everyone in the room as if through glass. They were already somewhere else. For the first 72 hours, the world lived in a state of shock that gradually transformed into something worse, into the understanding that this was real. Financial markets responded immediately and brutally. The euro fell to its lowest level in a decade. Baltic state bonds collapsed. Investors were pricing in a risk that had previously been considered purely theoretical. Meanwhile, shares of European defense conglomerates surged 40% in a single trading day. Rheinmetall, Leonardo, Thales, Saab, the market was voting with money. Europe would now have to arm itself, and it would be expensive, and it would be fast. In Warsaw, lines at ATMs appeared before the evening of the first day. Not because people were panicking, but because they remembered. Poland remembers what happens when great allies turn away or arrive too late. That memory doesn't live in textbooks. It lives in family stories and grandmother's accounts, in a way older people look eastward when they think no one is watching. In Tallinn, the city's mayor addressed residents that same evening. He spoke calmly, without panic, but asked everyone to check whether they knew the location of their nearest bomb shelter. Estonia is a country that shares a border with Russia stretching over 300 kilometers. A country where 1 in 3 adults has completed military reserve training. They had never allowed themselves illusions, even when Article 5 was still alive. Now, even less so. In Moscow that evening, official representatives were pointedly restrained. No triumphalism in their words. Only neutral comments about the new geopolitical reality and the need to rethink the security architecture in Europe. But diplomatic sources from several capitals reported the same thing. In the Kremlin that evening, there was a celebration. Quiet behind closed doors, but a celebration. A week later, Berlin convened an extraordinary EU leader summit. The chancellor opened the session with words few expected to hear from a German leader. The era in which we could delegate our security to someone else is over. Today, we either find an answer together, or each searches for one separately. And that will be far worse for everyone. There were three options on the table. The first, wait. Hope that Congress would block the withdrawal, that Trump would change his mind, that the next election would shift course. This was the position of the most optimistic or the most frightened, because when a person is too afraid to act, they always find a reason to wait. The second option, build European defense from scratch, relying on its own resources. France insisted on exactly this. Macron had talked about European strategic autonomy for years, and now he finally had an argument that was hard to counter. Not a beautiful concept, but a living necessity. The third option no one said aloud, but everyone understood. Seek new security guarantees. Revisit relations with Britain outside the EU framework. Perhaps, and this sounded unthinkable just a year ago, consider bilateral agreements with countries better left unmentioned at an open summit. Poland and the Baltic states listened to the French speeches about autonomy and looked at the map. On their map, Moscow was closer to Warsaw than Paris was. Strategic autonomy, that's fine, but when will it be ready? In 5 years? In 10? And what happens during those years? While Europe argued, the world beyond its borders was already moving. China watched silently for the first weeks, but its silence was loud. Chinese naval vessels began appearing in areas of the Pacific where the American fleet had previously dominated. Not aggressively, not provocatively, but the way a person appears who slowly takes a seat that has just been vacated. Taiwan announced a partial mobilization of reservists and asked Washington about the status of bilateral security guarantees. The response came 4 days later, vague, filled with diplomatic formulations that could mean anything or nothing specific. Japan and South Korea invited American diplomats for urgent consultations. The question was simple. If the U.S. has left NATO, are bilateral security agreements in Asia still valid? The Pentagon assured them they were. But the word assured already sounded different than it had a year ago. Tokyo announced an increase in its defense budget to 3% of GDP, a figure unthinkable for Japan just yesterday, given its pacifist constitution. Seoul accelerated its own nuclear conversation, the one that had been frozen for years under pressure from Washington. In the Middle East, American allies quietly but systematically reassessed their positions. If Washington is leaving its oldest and most solid alliance, what American word can now be trusted? This was not a rhetorical question. It was a question of survival for several regimes whose security had been built for decades on American guarantees. 3 months later, Putin delivered his first extended public statement on the matter. The tone was pointedly calm, almost boring. He spoke about the new reality, about space for constructive dialogue, and about Russia having always been ready for negotiations. No threats, no triumphalist rhetoric. A week after that statement, Russian armed forces conducted sudden large-scale exercises near the Estonian border, the largest in years, involving armored vehicles, aviation, and electronic warfare systems. Brussels sent a note of protest. Moscow ignored it, not rudely, not demonstratively, but simply, the way you ignore something you consider irrelevant. Estonia reached out to the United States. The U.S. responded that it was closely monitoring the situation and calls on all parties to de-escalate. Monitoring from 8,000 kilometers away. Calling on with words. Estonia's president spoke the following day. She spoke without anger, only with the tired clarity of someone who had long known this moment would come and had long been preparing for it. We cannot choose our neighbors, she said. But we can choose how costly it will be for anyone who decides to visit without an invitation. 6 months after the executive order was signed, Europe was moving faster than anyone could have predicted. Fear is a powerful accelerator. The EU approved a joint defense fund of 300 billion euros over 5 years. France and Britain, which, after long years of post-Brexit isolation, suddenly discovered that security matters more than trade disputes, announced an extension of the nuclear umbrella to their closest allies. The details were deliberately vague, but the mere fact of the announcement was a signal, clear and legible to everyone it was meant for. New defense factories were being built in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Sweden. Military conscription was being restored in countries that had abolished it 20 years ago, having decided the threat had passed. The threat, as it turned out, had gone nowhere. It had simply been waiting. NATO formally continued to exist. But without the United States, it resembled an old building after someone had removed the load-bearing walls. Still standing. But step inside, press on the right place, and no one could guarantee it would hold. Something new was being born. Less symmetrical than NATO, more contentious, with more national self-interest and a less defined chain of command. But alive, because it was being built not on abstract commitments, but on the concrete fear of concrete people in concrete countries. And what was happening inside the United States itself? Isolationists were triumphant. Finally, they said, American money would return to America. Finally, American soldiers would not die in foreign conflicts. Finally, Washington would think about Detroit and Cleveland rather than Tallinn and Warsaw. Critics said something different. Security is not an expense, they said. It's an investment. And the bill for its absence doesn't arrive immediately, but it always arrives. American global presence provided not only protection for allies, but access to markets, control over sea lanes, influence in international institutions. A network of allies is not charity. It is an instrument of power. And when you destroy an instrument, you don't become stronger. You simply end up with fewer options. The Pentagon quietly revised its strategies. Generals understood what they didn't dare say publicly in the current political climate. America's global presence rested not on brute force, but on trust, on predictability, on allies' confidence that an American word was an American word. That confidence was now broken, and restoring it would cost far more than breaking it had. No one knows how this story ends, because it hasn't ended yet, and all of us, whether we want it or not, are part of it. Perhaps Europe will truly become stronger. Forced to rely on itself, it will find the unity it had been unable to find voluntarily for years. Perhaps the crisis will become a catalyst, and in 10 years the European Union will have genuine common defense, real strategic independence, and enough weight to deter any aggressor without outside help. Perhaps a new American president in 2028 will return to the alliance, and everything will come together again on new terms, with a new balance and mutual respect. Perhaps this withdrawal will prove to be the most effective negotiating tactic in history. Brutal, dangerous, but effective. Or perhaps the crack will prove irreversible. Perhaps the trust built over 70 years cannot be restored in a single presidential term. Perhaps the world we knew, with the American umbrella, with collective defense, with the logic of all for one, will remain only in textbooks and in the memories of those who lived in it. One thing is certain. That morning of March 15th, 2026 showed everyone, no alliance is eternal. No security architecture is unbreakable. And the price of that truth is never paid by those who sign papers in warm offices. It is paid by those who live near the borders. Those who hear exercises beyond the horizon and try to decide, is this still an exercise or not anymore? If you're interested in looking at major geopolitical events through the lens of real human consequences, subscribe. There are more stories like this here. Simple words about a complicated world. And write in the comments, what do you think? How would this story really end?